pass for William. Daniels for the win. It's gone! LSU does it! Directing receivers, flips it to the end zone. Caught! Touchdown! Marvin Harrison Jr. making a huge impact.
Here's Edwards with the lay. Donovan Edwards down the sideline. Gets past Ransom. Donovan Edwards. Touchdown, Michigan.
This is the CFF Sites Week 1 podcast. My name is Joe DeSalvo, and we're doing something a little different this time. You know, Week 1, there's a lot of content for us to get up on the site leading up to the week. Mike's DFS write-ups, the player projections, all up for you guys to take in. Tons of games, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday night, big opening weekend. And so I felt the best way to do the podcast was wait for the weekend to end. Let's talk about what we think about the games, maybe some players that popped out at us. And, you know, this could be a regular trend because with so much content going up on the site at the end of the week, you know, it might be best to just throw a podcast up there to give reactions coming out of the weekend going into the new week. So new concept that we're going to try this week. And, you know, let's get into it. Before I do that, let's just say that the Week 1 waiver wire is up on the site. My Week 1 notes and observations are up on the site as well. And for you guys with All-American or Heisman memberships, the full waiver wire report can be found in the exclusive content of the homepage of the CFF site. We've got a waiver wire portal up there for you. And then for all the non-subscribers as well, non-members, you have an abbreviated waiver wire version. But look, Mike's got tons of names on that waiver wire list. If you have access to the exclusive content, if you're an All-American or Heisman member, and then also if you have those membership tiers, you have access to my notes and observations. And really, what my notes and observations are just my observations from a fantasy standpoint of what I viewed over the weekend and analyzing some of the numbers. And as the season wears on, I'll start throwing out some trends in that piece as well. But, you know, between the waiver wire piece, my notes and observations, it's hard to miss any players coming out of the weekend that shouldn't be on your fantasy radar. So that's up on the site. And hopefully we're going to have this podcast up and available to you guys on Tuesday. So that way it'll give you guys a couple of days to digest some content, listen to some college fantasy football content from the CFF site until we get the new weekly content up. The player projections, which are usually up late Wednesday, early Thursday, those take some time to get going. Just can't spit projections out early in the week. A lot of depth chart changes, a lot of injury news coming in. And so we want to wait until we can get a really good grasp of what those depth charts look like. So the projections usually hit the site late Wednesday night, early Thursday morning. That's been the usual protocol for the last few years. And of course, Mike's going to have all of his DFS write-ups here at the back end of the week. So this podcast is going to get you through until we get to the back end of the week, and a short week because Labor Day weekend, 5 days of games. So there's a lot to talk about, and usually Week 1, there's certainly a lot to talk about. So look, we're just going to keep this rather informal. I'm not going to go into every game, but I'm just going to talk about some of the things that I've observed, you know, coming out of the weekend. You know, so let's get into that. Let's run it down. Obviously, Week 0, you know, didn't do a lot in Week 0, but Week 1 now, there's a lot to talk about. So let's get into that. And so, you know, first thing I want to mention, Western Michigan, you know, the one thing that really jumped out at me is that, you know, when you look at them, their top 2 running backs had 50 rushing attempts this weekend, led by Jalen Buckley, 30 rushing attempts, 194 yards and a touchdown. If he gets the lion's share of carries in MAC play, that's going to be a good fantasy ad. But keep in mind, this performance was against St. Francis, so temper expectations, at least in the short term, right? Let's look at Georgia State's performance against Rhode Island. First of all, I don't know what to think about their performance. I thought Georgia State would win that game a little, more. I thought they'd win it at least handily. 7-point game. That game was tight all the way. And really what we got out of that was Marcus Carroll is the bell cow in that backfield. When you look at the Georgia State rushing attempts from a team, they had 36 rushing attempts as a team. 23 of those, Marcus Carroll, Danny Granger, 12. They accounted for all but one rushing attempt in that game. That's good news if you're a fantasy owner of Marcus Carroll moving forward. North Carolina State, I just want to touch on them just because Brennan Armstrong, I'm high on this year, as we can see why. I know that was a road game at UConn. UConn, respectable defense. Brennan Armstrong, I have no issue with him. I think he's going to be fine moving forward, but that NC State receiving core right now, from a fantasy standpoint, it's just a mess. Looks like they're going to spread things around a little bit. Curious to see how that shakes out. Real quick over at Missouri, when you look at the backfield there, they handled, their opponent fairly easily. Cody Schrader, 138 yards and a touchdown on the ground. Thought Nathaniel Pete actually looked decent as well, 52 yards and a touchdown as well. Curious to see how this moves forward. I think Schrader's going to get the bulk of the work, but I do think that Pete, as long as he's able to hold on the ball, is going to cut into those carries a little bit. Now let's talk about the big game that happened on the second biggest game, Nebraska-Minnesota. It was the tightest game that happened there when we started the week. Minnesota came back at the end. A couple of observations for me. Minnesota's just not going to be the ground and pound that we saw last year with Mo Ibrahim. As a matter of fact, I'm quite concerned a little bit about their running game. I thought Nebraska played decent defense. But I think that offense is going to take to the air a little bit more this year. And I think you're going to see a couple of backs. Sean Tyler is the running back one, but I just don't see the workload that, Ibrahim got last year. And I think we addressed that in the fall. I thought that was the expectation. It seems like that's the way it's going to play out. When you look at quarterback Jeff Sims, I just thought it was a very disappointing performance. Left points on the board, a couple of really bad interceptions. I think he's going to be able to give you some fantasy points on the ground. I think Nebraska is going to be able to play some respectable defense. Anthony Grant with that fumble. I wouldn't be surprised to see Gabe Ervin get a lot more carries in that backfield moving forward. And I think it's going to be him and Sims, 1-2 punch on the ground. I'm really not sure you're going to get much from Sims in the air. He didn't look good. He didn't look improved. So really curious to see how that plays out for you fantasy owners of Jeff Sims moving forward. Utah right now, the backfield, here's my thing. I would not be panicking if I had Jaquindon Jackson right now. You've got to see how these things shake out. And particularly, you've got to see how Utah changes things up once they get Cam Rising. Cam Rising has been now cleared for full go in practice. I'm just not sure he's been cleared for game and full contact as of right now. I seriously doubt. I don't think he's going to play this weekend when Utah travels to Baylor. So I think it's going to be a couple of weeks before we really see Utah settle into what their offense is going to look like when Cam Rising gets back. Tulsa, real quick mention on Tulsa, Braylon Braxton, who I was high on as a sleeper pick going into the season, 2 interceptions in the first quarter, got injured, and then all of a sudden Cardell Williams comes in and tears things up. So I think you've got to worry about, one, the injury. You got to worry about Cardell Williams and worry about whether or not he even comes back and improves confidence moving forward. UAB, I think it was nice to see Jermaine Brown punch it in and get some work. He had a couple of touchdowns on the ground. He was busy in the air. So my concern for UAB was whether or not we were going to get the same utilization as their running back. I don't think we're going to get quite that, but I think it's going to be good enough. I think Jermaine Brown's going to be solid for you moving forward. Let's go over to Arizona State. A lot of hype coming out about Jaden Rashada, Cameron Scatbo for Arizona State. The one thing that I think you've got to realize is this was against Southern Utah. I'm not really high on these guys right now because I'm just not sure how good Arizona State's going to be. I would really temper expectations right now. They could have lost to Southern Utah. Close game there, and I think as Arizona State plays some of the better teams in the Pac-12, they could be tough sledding in some of those weeks. Miami, Florida, Miami of Ohio. The note that came out here, a couple of things I want to mention here. And I think that you're going to look at Mark Fletcher, the freshman, I think could be in line to possibly take over that job as the season wears on. And, that's if Henry Parrish even still stays healthy. He's been banged up in his career. So let's see how that plays out. But for me, the biggest note in the Miami of Ohio Miami game is that Southeastern Louisiana FCS transfer Gage Larvadain, I think is how you say his name. He vultured all the targets in that Miami of Ohio passing game, and we know that what that wide receiver one can do for fantasy owners. He had 8 receptions for 80 yards against Miami. I think that looks good for his fantasy value and his fantasy prospects moving forward if he remains the wide receiver one in that offense as we get into MAC play. The Michigan State Central Michigan game, the one thing that I looked at, I was worried about the carries being shared in that Sparty backfield, but Nathan Carter ran the ball 18 times, topped the 100-yard mark, had a touchdown. When you look at the Michigan State schedule, I think there's going to be the opportunity for some spot starts for Nathan Carter if he's going to be able to hold on to that top spot and get a majority of carries in that offense. Now, on the Central Michigan side, good news if you're a fantasy owner of Birdie Manuel. Look, tough matchup against Michigan State, but he passed for 87 yards and threw a touchdown, which is kind of miles ahead of where he was a season ago. But more importantly, he ran the ball 17 times, only 41 yards. But as he gets going against into MAC play, if he's able to keep that QB1 spot, and they're going to utilize him as heavily in the run game in those conference matchups as they did against Michigan State, I wouldn't doubt that a couple of 100-yard rushing performances are going to be in his future. Now, that does devalue the running backs in that Central Michigan backfield, but good news if you're an owner of Birdie Manuel. When you look at Louisville, look, Jamari Thrash came through, caught a couple of touchdowns, 7 catches, 88 yards. That's good news for his fantasy owners. Devin Neal got a lot of the work in that Kansas backfield. That was good news there. We were worried about some share as well. Look, Hawaii now, 2 straight weeks in which the receivers Ashlock and McBride have caught a touchdown. That's good news for those guys. Oklahoma, I mentioned this in my notes and observations. Jaleel Farouk, quite disappointing that he did not have 1 catch, but in the 73-0 game, curious to see how things shake out for him long term. I think you've got to stay patient with him. Terrell Vaughn had a solid game on the road at Iowa. I think that bodes well for his fantasy prospects moving forward. And then, let's take a look at Michigan. I came in thinking we were going to see a little bit. I mean, look, Donovan Edwards had 12 carries, Blake Corum 10. Corum dominated the stat line, though, with 73 yards, and it was really that touchdown. And I think Corum is going to be the touchdown guy. Of course, Edwards had 4 catches for 33 yards. But, man, the way the Michigan offense looked, I think you're going to see J.J. McCarthy throw a few more touchdowns than he did last year. And I think that's going to dip into the rushing touchdowns of Blake Corum and Donovan Edwards as well. When you look at Fresno State, 2 things of note. Eric Brooks there, the leading receiver, and it was Elijah Gilliam who had 20 rushing attempts. Malik Sherrard, the starter, only 8 rushing attempts. So you wonder, is Gilliam going to take over in that running back 1 spot there? When I look at Kentucky, couple of notes here at Kentucky. Ray Davis, right? Ray Davis, and this is what we thought, that he was going to probably get most of the work in this Kentucky backfield. He had 14 of the, and look, this was a 44-14 game, and Kentucky still only had 20 rushing attempts. But Ray Davis had 14 of those 112, and he had 3 catches out of the backfield. So I think you've got to feel really good about Ray Davis moving forward. Tennessee, we've got to wait for things to play out at the receiver spot. I said in the preseason, I think we're going to see a mixed bag of things being spread out all over the place. I think that held true so far, at least through 1 week. I think the biggest surprise for me is that Dylan Sampson, 13 carries, 52 yards, 3 touchdowns, and he could have had a fourth, but he got stuffed at the goal line, and Joe Milton got that one. So I'm curious, is he going to be the guy in and around the goal line? And if so, man, that really does put a dent in the fantasy value of those backs in that Tennessee backfield. When we're looking at SMU, well, first of all, SMU, Louisiana Tech. Louisiana Tech has looked really bad the first couple of games they've played. I'm not seeing anything that's promising out of them. They need Marquise Crosby back. I know Smoke Harris had that big first game, but Hank Backmeyer does not look like he is any better against inferior competition. Take him out of the Mountain West, put him in that conference. So far, I'm not seeing any improvements from him. And of course, disappointing Jordan Curley, only 1 catch for SMU. Should guys jump ship? Questions coming in already after 1 week. You have to stay patient on some of these guys. Look, SMU broke out to a really big lead, and all of a sudden they just pounded the rock in the running game. So I think you've got to really hold from that point right now. Colorado TCU, real interesting matchup because there's a lot of hype all over. Look, here's the thing. I'm going to be honest with you. Colorado was better than I thought. Or looked better than I thought. But I'll be honest with you, I didn't think TCU was going to be that great. I'm not impressed much by the win of Colorado over TCU. I didn't think TCU looked that good anyway. I don't think Chandler Morris looks that good of a quarterback. But, man, when you put up 500 yards passing, it's not – look, I mean, that was certainly an impressive performance. Now, looking individually at some of the players – the one guy I'm not on board yet, and I could be wrong. I may be proven wrong about this, but I'm not quite buying Dylan Edwards yet unless he starts getting more work in the running game. I know he had 4 touchdowns. He had 5 receptions for 135 yards out of the backfield. You take away some of those big receiving plays, and all of a sudden, he's just kind of 24 yards and a touchdown. Now, I know that's where he fits into this offense, and so I'm good with that. But of the receivers, Travis Hunter played a lot more than I ever thought that he would play. Mike was telling me in the spring that it looked like Hunter was going to get significant snaps, that he wanted to put him into the projections and the rankings. I didn't think a player of that caliber would risk playing both ways. But look, he was arguably the best receiver on the field for them. I don't see where he's going to play any less. And as long as he can hold up, I think he's going to be playing consistently on offense. Xavier Weaver, Jimmy Horn Jr., look, solid options there. We were on Xavier Weaver in the preseason as well. But Edwards is the one that I have reservations on adding to my roster right away. I hope I'm proven wrong for some of you guys that went out there and added him, but we'll see how that plays out. At TCU, the backfield, really Trey Sanders, 46 yards on the ground, but he punched it in 3 times. Imani Bailey, 164 yards. He did have a fumble that cost him some playing time. But from that passing game on TCU, if Chandler Morris doesn't improve, this TCU offense is going to be the TCU is going to be in for a long year. I feel they lost too much talent on both sides of the ball for them to even come close to what they were last year. It would not surprise me if they're a middle of the Big 12 team at best this year. Scrolling through the games, let's go to Iowa State because they did have a 30-9 win this past week. But when you look at that, it looks like that, Katavius Norton got most of the carries in that backfield. But when you look at that passing game, they only had 116 passing yards. They're going up against a tough Iowa team. We'll see what Iowa State's about moving forward, but I'm just not feeling confident in anything in their offense right now. Mississippi Ole Miss. Huge game by Trey Harris. The Louisiana Tech transfer. Zachary Franklin nowhere to be found right now, and they're rolling up 73 points on Mercer. Of course, they're going to roll up the points because Spencer Sanders is going to come in. He looked just as good as Jackson Dart did. I'm going to stick with my prediction that at some point down the line, we're going to see both of these. We're going to see alternating, games maybe when these guys play. But I don't know if that's going to be this week or not. Look, Jackson Dart looked really solid, but I'll tell you, they have a very good Tulane opponent They're going on the road this week, and that's a very good Tulane team that they're playing. A big step up from Mercer. So I'm really curious to see how Dart and this offense performs against Tulane, because definitely Quinshaw Judkins is the real deal. Let's see, any Ohio State. You can't go a week one podcast without talking about Ohio State. It was interesting because I remember, if you listen back to the shows Mike and I did, early on in the spring, I was on Travion Henderson as being the yardage guy, and maybe Mayan Williams being more of a touchdown guy. And in the early spring, I thought Mayan Williams would actually hold on to that one spot. I don't think that's going to be happen. It's going to happen. Travion Henderson is the more talented back out of the bunch. I was just shocked that Chip Trayanum is cutting into both of their carries. I mean, he had 8 rush attempts, Travion Henderson 12, Mayan Williams 7. Look, Kyle McCord's got to do better in that passing game. When you've got Marvin Harrison on your fantasy roster and he only has 2 catches for 18 yards, and Emeka Egbuka has 3 catches for 16, there's a little bit to be concerned about coming out of week one. Let's see if Ohio State can kind of get that right, and McCord can get going and get those receivers going in the passing game, because they can run the ball as well as they want, but until they get those things go, until they get that passing game going, they're just not going to be the Ohio State that we've been used to over the last couple of years. Washington, solid start to the season, no surprise there. Texas, obviously, with the running game we have there. Jonathan Brooks is obviously a hold right now. CJ Baxter got the start. He left the game. I don't think that's a serious injury. But let's see how things play out for that Texas backfield after the game against Alabama. It'll be interesting to see how things play out this week. Over at Appalachian State, another interesting thing where Ryan Berger was tabbed the starter. Joey Aguilar came in. Looks like he's probably going to be the starter moving forward, when 11 of 13 threw 4 touchdown passes. So I think you're looking at Aguilar as the starter at Appalachian State. South Florida, West Kentucky, a huge scare with wide receiver Malachi Corley, who was pretty much the consensus number 2 receiver behind Marvin Harrison Jr. Caught 5 passes, I believe, on the opening drive, got injured and then left the game. He was out for the game. He was actually carted off. But I know in the post-game press conference, I think the coach said that it was a chest injury and that he didn't think it would be a long-term injury. Should be back, hopefully as early as their next game. Syracuse ran up 65 points on Colgate, and I do get that it was Colgate, but I'm telling you, maybe we're sleeping a little bit on the Syracuse offense. Between Garrett Schrader and Del Rio Wilson, they combine for over 400 yards passing in this game. Don't sleep on that Syracuse offense this year for sure. Cal playing North Texas. Let's talk about that matchup, because there's something I want to mention in this. And that is Jeremy Maclin was a guy that I kind of had under the spotlight. I was kind of tabbing him as the guy that I really preferred of all the North Texas receivers going into the preseason. Huge game, 4 catches, 122 yards, and 2 touchdowns in that opener against Cal. I'm not expecting that type of performance every single week, but I think you see what his upside can be in that offense, and it'll be interesting as North Texas moves forward and plays some other opponents that are at the G5 level as opposed to P5. Marshall really struggled early as a owner of Rasheen Ali. I've got him, I think, at least a couple of shares of Rasheen Ali. Was really concerned that Marshall wasn't doing anything against Albany, and then all of a sudden Rasheen Ali took off, finished 137 yards, 2 touchdowns. So a good start for one of the top fantasy running backs this year. James Madison, we talk about quarterback changes. Alonzo Barnett was tabbed the starter going into that game. It was Jordan McLeod who threw for 144 yards and 2 touchdowns. I would expect McLeod to be the starter as we move forward. Florida Atlantic 42-20 winners this week over Monmouth. I think the good news is if you scooped up Casey Thompson late, you might have a nice little fantasy gem sleeper right there. Thompson went 20 of 25 for 280 yards and 5 touchdowns. Of course, the Owls are not going to play Monmouth every week, but that's a good sign if you were able to scoop him up. USC 66, Nevada 14. The one thing that really that interests me out of this matchup is that Marshawn Lloyd had a big game on the heels of Austin Jones having a big week one. And I mentioned this in my notes and observations, and that is, you know what? If this is a back and forth where there's going to be a different guy leading this backfield and they're going to jockey for that top spot every week, this is going to create a real big headache for fantasy owners of both Austin Jones and Marshawn Lloyd. If we don't get any consistency in the next couple of weeks and that plays out, it's going to be hard for fantasy owners to trust, to have any trust to start either one of those guys moving forward. Kansas State, let's just talk about that backfield a little bit because I was very high on DJ Giddens in the spring. Treshaun Ward did punch in a touchdown. That kind of made up the difference between his 56 yards and Giddens' 128 yards. But it looks like right now Giddens is going to be the main back, but I think both of them are going to get significant work in that backfield. You know, Will Shepherd, I want to mention him with Vanderbilt. He's now caught at least 2 touchdowns in 2 consecutive games, and I think that bodes well for him. Even though Vanderbilt's playing in the SEC and in the SEC East, I think you're going to see some consistent numbers from Will Shepherd. Maybe not 100-yard games, but I think that 60 to 70 yards and a touchdown is going to be really, really possible for him on a week-to-week basis. Texas State Baylor. Texas goes to Baylor, upsets Baylor. Let's talk about Baylor first. I was a little bit more shocked that Richard Reese didn't get a little bit more work. Dominic Richardson really dominated that Baylor backfield. I think they do need to use Reese a little bit more. I just think that he's a little bit of a game breaker. I know he's a little smaller, but I think they've got to find ways to get that kid the ball. Now, over on the Texas State side, I watched a good bit of snaps in this game. I watched quite a few drives in this game, and I can tell you what, as far as TJ Finley was absolutely dropping some dimes. He was hitting receivers where he needs to hit them, and in GJ Kinney's offense, that's what is necessary. And when I watch TJ Finley make throws in this offense, it leads me to believe that Malik Hornsby never had a chance at this job as long as the TJ Finley who we thought TJ Finley was going to show up. Malik Hornsby's asset is his legs. It's not necessarily throwing the ball. If Finley was in trouble as a passer, they were going to have to change the schematics of this offense, and they were going to have to change it so that Hornsby's legs could really do some damage against defensive opponents. They're not going to have to change much at all because Finley can move just enough in this offense. I mean, look, he did have a rushing touchdown, but the throws he was making against a solid defensive opponent, unquestionably, TJ Finley is going to be the starter at Texas State offense. There is no doubt. I wouldn't even be surprised to see Malik Hornsby transfer out of there because, it depends if Finley stays there a couple of years or not. But Finley, to me, has got that job nailed down. I know UTSA struggled in their loss against Houston, but look, Frank Harris was just coming back from off-season surgery. He didn't have a lot of work in the preseason. I still thought that he was good, but he's down to Corian Clark. He lost Zachary Franklin. They've got Kavorian Barnes. I like Frank Harris. You've got to give UTSA some time to put this together a little bit. They're fighting. I mean, when you lose Clark and Franklin, that's a big loss for the offense. They were hoping to get Clark back. He hasn't made it yet. It's just been Joshua Cephas. And so they need to get some of those receivers healthy, but I'm not really worried about Frank Harris. Houston is a respectable opponent. I think he's going to be fine. Let's see. Let's scroll down the list. I'm going to try to find, Toledo almost pulled the upset at Illinois. They lose 30-28. I have been banging the Daquan Finn drum all off season. I love Daquan Finn. I love what Toledo did in this game against Illinois and the prospects of Daquan Finn moving forward. If you remember the shows in the spring, this was all about Daquan Finn staying healthy. If Daquan Finn gives you a healthy 12 games, you're probably looking at a top 10 fantasy quarterback this year. North Carolina, South Carolina, the one thing that we talked about this in the spring too, that we liked Drake May, even though there was a change in offensive coordinator. because we felt that North Carolina was still going to have to put up points, right? I mean, like, we were not expecting their defense to be that good. They hold South Carolina to 17 points, and their defense actually looked pretty decent. If I'm a fantasy owner of Drake May, I don't want that North Carolina defense to be any good because I want to score some points. If this is the North Carolina defense that we're going to see for 12 games, then, this might be the Drake May that we see for most of the year. This isn't the Drake May that was one of the top 2 fantasy quarterbacks up until about week 10 last year. He's still going to be very good. The question is whether or not, if North Carolina is improved defensively, if they're going to need May to put up 4 to 5 touchdowns every week. So that's my concern with Drake May moving forward. Alabama 56-7, and let's just say this. Jalen Milroe against Middle Tennessee, we were pretty much expecting that. There were a lot of questions on who was going to be the quarterback coming out of Alabama camp. We started to get wins that it was Jalen Milroe. We threw him into our rankings. The one thing about Milroe compared to Buckner and Simpson is that he obviously has the higher upside. 48 rushing yards and 2 touchdowns certainly prove that. And he was 13 of 18 passing the ball for 3 touchdowns. Ja'Corey Brooks didn't even play the first half as well, so he'll be there in the next game as well. They didn't even need him. Jace McClellan punched in a touchdown. But let's see Jalen Milroe against Texas in this upcoming matchup. Remember, Alabama struggled against Texas last year on the road. This year, they get Texas at home. Texas Tech goes to Wyoming, goes to Laramie, loses 35-33. I don't think there's any reason to be concerned about Texas Tech at this point. Wyoming is a tough place to play. Wyoming is a very respectable defense. I think your shares of Texas Tech players are going to be just fine. Virginia Tech 36-17 over Old Dominion. I mean, who didn't think Ali Jennings was going to score a touchdown against his former team? 5 receptions, 72 yards, and 2 touchdowns against his old team, Old Dominion. The one note that I take away from this game, and I think this is a real interesting note, is that Grant Wilson for Old Dominion threw 2 touchdown passes. He also led the team with 19 rushing attempts and had 81 yards on the ground. That, to me, is a very favorable stat line against a decent Power 5 team. Old Dominion moving forward, you have to if you need some depth at quarterback, you don't like what you have or just want to add a name, I think Grant Wilson is a real interesting name that you might want to dip into. If he's going to get that many rushing attempts and be that efficient in that offense, put up a couple of touchdowns passing, I think you can have a pretty decent quarterback there, maybe a quarterback 3, a quarterback 4 with spot start potential. South Alabama playing Tulane. The early fumble did not do LaDamian Webb any favors. It was a running back by committee from that point forward, but I can tell you that Michael Pratt in that offense was quite impressive. It's interesting because I mentioned Ole Miss is about to play Tulane this week, and when you look at the yards per catch on the Ole Miss receivers and you look at the yards per catch for Tulane receivers, you're looking at a game that might have a lot of vertical passing in it. I'm really excited to see this Tulane-Ole Miss matchup. Pratt felt like he was completing a 20 or 30-yard pass on almost every drive. UTEP, I want to mention UTEP because they beat up, not because they beat Incarnate Word 28-14, but when the lines drop, they're actually favored over Northwestern this coming week. That's really interesting. I never thought that watching UTEP that they would be favored over Northwestern. I don't know. That one just seems a little funny to me. I from a betting standpoint, let's see where it plays out, but I kind of like Northwestern on that right now. BYU against Sam Houston State. Sam Houston State played some decent defense. The one interesting note to come out of this matchup is that UNLV transfer Aiden Robbins, who was BYU's starting running back, was relieved at one, or was, the coaches decided the offense needed a spark, and they went to running back LJ Martin. LJ Martin jump-started the offense a bit, finished with 16 carries, 91 yards. And now if you've got Aiden Robbins, you kind of have to sweat out LJ Martin's presence right now. UCLA 27-13 over Coastal Carolina. A lot of debate going into the season and throughout the preseason. Carson Steele or TJ Harden at running back. Carson Steele dominated the carries early. Harden still finished with just as many yards and almost as many carries. Carson Steele caught 4 passes out of the backfield for 20 yards and a touchdown. The good thing about that game being on late is I got to watch most of it. And 2 takeaways from that. I think Carson Steele is the unquestionable running back 1. And I think it's only inevitable. I know Dante Moore made one really poor throw, really bad decision, but that kid's going to be playing soon. So if you have any shares of Dante Moore, get ready because they're coming. I think he's going to be the starter very soon. Over at Oregon State, I want to mention this because this was a topic I remember Mike and I were talking about when we were doing projections. When you think over the last couple of years at Oregon State, they've always had some type of package around the goal line, whether they were using tight end Jay Coletto. Now they go get DJU. Damian Martinez, 18 carries, 145 yards. I can see this guy averaging over 100 yards a game for the season and maybe not even scoring double-digit. I can see him going for 1,200 plus yards, maybe 1,300, and maybe not even scoring 10 touchdowns. Because if his touchdowns don't come from maybe 5, 6 yards, maybe even 10 yards out, they had and we learned a lot in the first drive of the game. The first drive of the game, Oregon State went down, drove to the 1-yard line, and I said, here we go. Let's see what Oregon State has for the goal line. Immediately, Deshaun Fenwick comes in. DJU gets the first carry stuffed. Fenwick gets the second stuffed. DJU punches it in on the third carry. With DJU being such a big quarterback, it is not going to surprise me that Martinez is going to lose out on a lot of those goal line carries. And as long as Fenwick's around and they're going to roll him into that package, then I think if you're an owner of Damian Martinez, you gotta love his yardage potential, but I'm very concerned on whether or not he's even going to be able to hit double-digit touchdowns this year. And I think this is a kid that can explode for 1,200 yards, rushing yards or more. Florida State LSU, I'll touch on this just because it was such a big game. LSU did not look ready to play in that game whatsoever. Look, I know that they convert a couple of early 4th down opportunities that they didn't. That compounded with the fact that Florida State committed some knucklehead penalties early on in the game. Had LSU been able to convert, that first trip down, another 4th down and really turn some of those bonehead mistakes by Florida State into points, I think you would have seen a different game. But make no mistake about it, Florida State just looked ready to play. LSU did not look organized and prepared for that game. And Keon Coleman and Johnny Wilson are going to be trouble for a lot of defenses. And I'm telling you, Florida State, to me, looked the part. They looked like they could beat anybody in the country the way that they looked against LSU. It is not going to surprise me to see the Seminoles run the table, particularly knowing that they're not going to face a good Clemson team, because I just got finished watching that Clemson debacle against Duke, and Clemson does not look the part either. Clemson did not look good at all. Duke beat them 28-7, and it felt like they beat them pretty handily. And I didn't think Duke looked great because, as always, Clemson's defense is going to be pretty darn decent. But look, new offensive coordinator coming over from TCU, Garrett Riley, just didn't work in week 1. Clemson's got a lot of work to do, but that's not a number 9 ranked team in the country. I can make a case that I think by the season's end, LSU is going to look a lot better or closer to their 5 ranking than where they started. I can't say that for Clemson. They didn't even look like a top 20 team tonight. But that's it. From a fantasy standpoint, look, Will Shipley, nice performance, 114 yards, had a receiving touchdown. Cade Klubnik, very underwhelming in that offense. Riley Leonard did Riley Leonard things, probably going to have much better days as he faces weaker defenses moving forward. So I think you feel really good if you've got Riley Leonard moving forward. So look, that's a wrap on week one. I think I touched on a lot. There's a lot more in my notes and observations. Mike's got so many players in his waiver wire write-ups. I think there's like 40 plus players in there if you've got access to the exclusive waiver wire report. But that's going to do it for week one. Week one review. Wanted to get a podcast out there, give you guys some thoughts and some things to think about, or just some of our observations coming out of the first full week of games as we move into week two. And as we hit the back end of this week, we'll go ahead and we're going to get all those projections and all of the DFS write-ups ready to rock and roll. So if you're not a member of the CFF site, come on in. There's a lot of content up and a lot more to come. But that's going to do it for the week one show and the wrap up. My name is Joe DeSalvo for the CFF site. We'll see you in week two.